Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isvander Batmagelic. Last year, the Washington Post published a remarkable series of investigative reports called The Money War. The series included 8 deeply reported stories focusing on the human, political, and economic fallout of U.S. sanctions. My guest today is the journalist behind the series, Jeff Stein, who is the Post's chief economics correspondent. Today's episode will dive into one story from the series, which focuses on the Guatemalan town of El Estor. El Estor was once a bustling mining hub, home to 2 major nickel mines that provided thousands of jobs and sustained local government. In 2022, U.S. sanctions shuttered those mines almost overnight, triggering massive job losses, starving the town of public revenues, and collapsing small businesses. Families that had worked their way into the middle class were suddenly plunged into poverty, and many residents, facing few options, were forced to emigrate, setting out on the dangerous journey north to the United States. Jeff's reporting from El Estor bears witness to the ways in which sanctions policy set in Washington, perhaps well-intentioned, can change the fortunes of communities thousands of miles away. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're lucky to have Jeff here because he's just passing through London, which means that we can record this interview in person, which is very cool.
And it means the flights are all expensed and free, I think.
Thank you to the Washington Post.
If the IRS is listening.
Jeff, I want to start with kind of your motivations in writing this big series of reports. I think it's really remarkable because it was one of the few kind of attempts to comprehensively look at different aspects of how U.S. sanctions policy was emerging and the effects that it was having in different places around the world. And across multiple pieces, you look at sanctions really as not just a geopolitical tool or a Washington industry, but also as a human story. And you connect these frontline experiences in places like Guatemala to decisions made in the Treasury Department. What were your motivations in kind of embarking on this big reporting series? And what did you want to achieve for readers of the Post?
So, as a reporter who covers the Treasury beat, you are on the Treasury email listserv. And what that means is every time a sanction is imposed, Treasury will send out a little news alert. And normally it's, you've seen them. They're incredibly brief, 2 or 3 sentences sometimes. This person you've never heard of, this entity, this business, this organization, and the volume with which these notifications were landing in my inbox as a reporter was kind of staggering. And I'd been on the Treasury beat for a long time and been getting these emails for years and years. And it had sort of fueled this question of like, if I'm getting these emails like several times a day often, how many sanctions are we actually imposing and where and why and how big is this this government policy? And I think I really appreciated the way you led up to your question, because what we really tried to do is to sort of show how this policy that feels desiccated, can sound technical, dry, really has very, very vivid human consequences. It's very easy, of course, to go in after U.S. troops have been in Fallujah and identify the damage done. And yet this tool has become a way for the U.S. government to attempt at least to effectuate foreign policy outcomes with tremendous reverberations on the ground without that kind of visible tangible result that it's easy to point a news camera at. So it was a fun challenge as a reporter to say, how do we make real and concrete what we know to be real and concrete, but are often sort of hidden behind this sort of technical language and this sort of dry infrastructure and sort of consequences that are harder to measure?
The example you just gave of, kind of troops deploying to Fallujah is an interesting one because it leads directly to the question I was going to ask. And it goes back to this idea that, let's say you're a reporter covering the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. There is an expectation that at some point you might kind of deploy to the place where the U.S. is fighting. You might embed with the soldiers on the ground to try and understand, what the U.S. is aiming to do. Are they achieving their goals? You were covering the Treasury beat. There's really no expectation that anyone covering that beat actually goes to the places around the world where Treasury policies are having an effect. So how did you convince your editors that the natural thing you had to do, given that you wanted to cover this story, was actually go to Guatemala and report from the ground? And how did being on the ground change your perspective?
It's really tricky as a reporter because you're simultaneously telling your editors, look, you gotta, because remember, the expenses here are really big, and with all sort of respect to Substack and podcasting and everything, in the independent media sphere, like this reporting takes resources. Like there's a lot of money involved, and the Post paid for me to fly to Guatemala City, drive 5-6 hours to the northeast with a translator and a photographer. So it's 3 people being paid for a week in a very remote region, and hotels and so that really adds up. And from the reporter's perspective, you're like, I think this is going to be really vivid, but you don't really know for sure until you get there. And people who especially in this kind of place, people say one thing and then don't necessarily show up for the interview, or some of their details might change here or there, or they say they're comfortable with using the name and then they turn out not to be. And then so it's a bit of a sort of high wire act as a reporter, where you're simultaneously trying to tell your editors that that this is worth the Post's expense, but also trying to manage expectations because there are things sort of beyond your control and beyond your visibility. I will say, at the risk of sounding, self-congratulatory, I guess, I feel like being able to be in Estor was absolutely essential for the story. This is really, Guatemala is a very poor country generally, but the part of the country I was in was extremely difficult to get to, 5 or 6 hours along a lot of sort of back roads to this mining town. The poverty in the town itself is quite striking, and yet like that, within that world, it is like that's the affluent area, because there are many people who live sort of basically in shacks in the woods along the lake. So like that's like the truly impoverished part. And yeah, I guess, beyond sort of the individual interviews, there were so many striking visuals from being there that I found really useful for the story. The thing that really stayed in my mind in particular, and this is just the kind of thing that you can't get from doing interviews over the phone, is we just went to like the main market, sort of open air, kind of like I'm not sure what the right word is, but sort of like open air market with just like lines of local vendors. And, there's the woman with like the raw chicken and like the like handful of vegetables. And what was just really striking was just going from person to person in that market, because this was not these weren't people who had any interest in, trying to get their jobs back from, the mine reopening. They were just totally, innocent bystanders who were not primed, to think of this fight really. But what they knew was what had happened in their lives, which was that the U.S. closing this mine through sanctions had taken what was a already pretty hard scrabble existence and really put them into very deep poverty. This one woman we talked to who was selling raw chicken sort of in one of these stands was saying, she used to sell, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but, $50 a day, and now it was like 3 or 4. And so there were a number of people in that market whose lives had been sort of fundamentally upended by this. And that's the kind of thing that you don't really get from Washington.
And I guess we might have a question mark as a reader trying to understand, what would be the importance of these mines for a community. But you've just described it, that basically you have a country that's generally quite poor, a part of the country that's very remote, and that the livelihoods of the people in this place are very connected to the fortunes of this mine. And there's some individual people you profile, like Jose Trabaninos and Eddie Alcaron, and you tell their story and you explain that because they were able to have jobs at this mine, they were earning a higher wage than average for what was common in the community. And that meant that they could not only feed their families, but they could actually think a little bit about a kind of social mobility. They could maybe buy land, they could build their homes. And that ultimately the mining, while it was a dangerous, unglamorous, difficult way of making a living, nonetheless, it could be something that was sort of coveted and important and on which other people depended. For example, the small business owners like this lady who was selling chicken at the market. Can you paint a picture a little bit for us of like what was daily life for the mining workers and what was it about their livelihoods that was something that was sort of precious and important before this moment when the sanctions kicked in?
Yes, I mean, it's not at all an overstatement to say this was the source of economic stability for thousands of people in the region. And in fact, as we write in the story, Jose Trabaninos was from, a couple hours south and had a kid and had a wife, and came to Estor to work for the mine because that was, even where he was, which was, I think a couple hours from Estor, this was really one of the very, very few avenues of economic opportunity. And it was a little humbling, because, as a Western journalist at the Washington Post, it wasn't even immediately obvious to me. It took some time for me to see that what I honestly regarded as signs of poverty were in some ways signs that for these people that they had achieved a degree of stability. They were able to, the wife of Jose Trabaninos, she showed me photos of a birthday party they had for their daughter, which had, Peppa Pig cartoons and, by any sort of Western standard was like incredibly modest. But for them, like they were able to throw a birthday party for their daughter. They were able, from the mine's income, which Jose had sort of worked, from the very bottom and up into a sort of more sort of slightly technical job, they were able to have that sort of bit of modest comfort, and it build attachments to their homes. They had an oven. They had like occasional electricity even, and so those things, which to me didn't seem like signs of wealth, and frankly, from the perspective of an international mining conglomerate with large profits, like should more of those profits be directed to people in their workforce, I think is a very valid question. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't negate the reality that this still was a pathway to the middle class for some of these people.
So it was that pathway until November 2022, when the Treasury Department sanctioned the Guatemalan subsidiaries of a Swiss-owned conglomerate called Solvay. And Solvay and its subsidiaries were responsible for the nickel mining operations in Estor. And the justification at the time was that U.S. officials claimed that these companies were engaged in bribery, they were engaged in abuses, particularly against indigenous communities in that region. And so the sanctions were sort of put forward as a kind of moral action. It was an attempt by the U.S. to hold corrupt actors accountable. And I think it's worth noting that at this time during the Biden administration, there was a kind of global anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy drive. So this was not an unusual action. It was part of a series of actions that the U.S. was taking to try and fight corruption using sanctions. So from your reporting, on the Treasury beat, trying to understand what the U.S. was trying to accomplish, what was the goal as far as you understood it with these sanctions, and why did they decide to target these mines in particular?
Yeah, so the Treasury was quite adamant that these really were about sort of the rights of the indigenous peoples and the workers. And I don't make any, I don't want to pull any punches when I, describe the mine's history, because while it is true, as we've just been discussing, that they really did provide economic security for their workers, this is not the best corporate actor. They had a long history of really abusing the indigenous peoples there, of forcible evictions. Some of the security forces that they had contracted out or were connected to them had been incredibly accused of being involved in sexual assault. So this mine is not, has a genuinely checkered and contested history and past. I think what was deeply confusing to the workers and the people of Estor is that this is not the only business in Guatemala with a checkered history of dealing with indigenous populations. The coffee industry, for instance, has tons of allegations against it. The international, sort of coffee companies, and really international capital operating in Central and Latin America often has really horrendous civil rights and workers' rights records. So that, I think, fueled this question of what was really going on here? I think it's worth adding to the mix that on top of sort of the kleptocracy thing, which I think you're right to bring up, the U.S. at this point was, and I guess really still is, engaged in trying to establish an independent supply chain for the production of automobile batteries, and that involves nickel. And while it was Swiss-owned, these companies had heavy Russian involvement, and the companies ultimately went to the U.S. and had their designations lifted, in part by saying, look, we are changing this so we don't have Russians involved. And I think, obviously, from the U.S. perspective, it may not sound as good to say, oh, this was about, we shut down these mines because we're trying to force Guatemalan mines to, have a more U.S.-based corporate structure. But it's hard to avoid the conclusion, given the fact that many other exploitative industries were not sanctioned, that was part of the calculation.
Do you think that means that the trigger here, because as you've just explained, there are a lot of companies engaged in problematic activity around the world, but especially in Central America. Do you think this means that the Russia connection was the specific trigger for the designation? Because the thing that I was also wondering is, and I'm curious to know whether you got any indications about this from your conversations with your sources, but how did a company like this even end up on the radar of the Treasury Department, where they decide to make this a priority in the grand scheme of things?
That's a really important question that I'm not sure I, unfortunately, ever really got to the bottom of in my reporting. And if you're a OFAC staffer listening to this and you want to reach out, you can contact me securely on Signal. I think what was going on was that a lot of the sort of competing nickel companies had a vested interest in going after parts of the supply chain that were Russian involved. The price of nickel rose around this time, not, I don't think just because of what was happening with the Estor mine, but reducing supply on the international market could incentivize and raise profits for competing firms.
So we should talk about what actually happened in the community. So there was the sanctions designation in November 2022. And we've already talked a little bit about the economic effects for ordinary people in terms of losing their jobs and livelihoods. How quickly did that actually happen? From the time of the designation to the point at which people start to feel pain in this community in El Estor, how fast was that? And also, one of the things that your reporting points to is that it's not just that individuals lost their jobs, but also the local government lost tax revenue. Can you explain the significance of that?
I mean, it was really like a bomb went off. I mean, it's hard to overstate how significant this closure was. Like, a great recession potentially impact. The economic data are not like that great in rural Guatemala. Your listeners might be shocked to hear. I actually think it's really, really important that you bring up like how long it took, because if Treasury had done this and then a month later been like, okay, see, this is evidence we're serious, like correct the things that we don't want to see in your governance record and your Russian involvement and et cetera, but we'll restore, we'll remove the sanctions pretty quickly, that would have been, there would have been some impact, but it would have been extremely mitigated. The margins on the time here are super important. The workers did actually get like a degree of severance pay. And so it really takes months and months and months for them to say like, okay, like, is this a permanent thing? Is this a temporary thing? And as the story reports, as time goes on, right, this is a part of and this is sort of, to me, like the real perverse crux of the whole story is Guatemala at this point was a huge source of in-migration to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And it was a top political concern for the Biden administration to stop the mass exodus of people out of Guatemala into the United States. And yet, just as they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars through Kamala Harris's initiatives to stop out-migration from Guatemala, they are, on the other hand, sanctioning this mine. And as the months drag on and no one's paying attention to this, or maybe that's unfair, as they're waiting for action, as the people in Guatemala are waiting to see what's going to happen, they realize and start to think, I might need to go to the U.S. And then so many of them do end up fleeing to the U.S. because of the action the U.S. took as it's simultaneously trying to spend government money to stop the inflow of migrants to the U.S. So it's this incredible like contradiction of U.S. policy. And for people with no income and no alternatives, some of them take up odd jobs. They try, some of them I talked to tried selling cell phones, or they tried being an auto mechanic, and some of them even take to like working in the open air market. And when the main source of foreign capital is just immediately drained up and there's no sort of economic engine for the community anymore, these really severe effects start happening. And there's no way to escape that domestically. It's not like, they have an active, thriving job market and can switch easily. So the economic consequences. I mean, I think we talked about how the city government laid off close to 40% of all of its workers after the mine closed. I spoke to the mayors who had two or three of the mayors from Estor, and one of them actually had been like quite skeptical of the mine, had been someone who had been really on the attack against its human rights and environmental records. There was allegations that they poisoned the lake, and there's a lot of local fishermen. Fishing is a very big deal there. And yet this mayor said that the closure of the mine really changed his mind about it. He had been very skeptical, and watching the effects of the closure made him think that the sanctions had to be removed immediately.
And I think that goes back to this question about, what were the intentions behind the measures? Because surely if you wanted to intervene to try and get a mining company to be a more sort of socially responsible corporate actor, to not engage in abuses against the indigenous community, to not pollute the local environment, to pay a more fair wage, you would probably use different tools than basically making it impossible for this mine to do business to the extent where the mine shuts down and then it destroys the livelihoods of all of these people. I mean, I think one question you mentioned, this like sort of counterintuitive or counterproductive aspect of this policy, given what the Biden administration was trying to do broadly around immigration. But to what extent did you identify that the Treasury Department had looked at any of these possibilities before they made this designation? I mean, did you get any indication that there had been an assessment or an effort to understand what the cost benefit might be if they target this mine? And even if they are able to succeed, let's say, getting the Russians out of the corporate structure, if that means that actually the local community is going through a very, very difficult period.
I think you've really put your finger on what I think is maybe the core issue here, which is the absence of information about the sanctions being imposed. You may have heard that the Treasury Department hired an economic analyst. My understanding is under the Biden administration, that person was fully immersed in the economic consequences of the Russia sanctions, which is totally logical. But the idea that they have, I think maybe it's now 2 or 3 people. We have sanctions on dozens of countries, tens of thousands of entities across the world. Treasury could not tell me if they'd done any economic assessments about the impact to Estor. I think they would have if they had. That's a bit of conjecture. But I did push them for that in the course of reporting. I said, I'm seeing all these economic effects. Were they worth it? Did you know that they were going to be there and you just decided that it was a price worth paying? If they'd wanted to give that answer, they could have, and they chose to not respond to those questions. We reported in the story that there were officials in the Treasury Department who were deeply opposed to these because of the humanitarian and economic impacts, and that the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala had been aggressive and pushing them, and that was part of why Treasury felt like it had to do this. Although it really is it's the Treasury Department doing it. So I don't want to say that they have no role here, obviously, or we're helpless to the demands of state and the embassy.
But that's a bit disconcerting that the embassy, which is on the ground in Guatemala, would have been one of the actors that was actually pushing for this measure, because you would imagine that they would have a more acute understanding of how this could blow back versus, people at Treasury that are looking at this from a higher level.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tangent that I'm not sure makes that much sense for us to get into, but I guess beyond the question of the mining company's records, there was this broader electoral question in Estor, in Guatemala more broadly, where there was pressure from human rights groups to issue sanctions on the private sector that was supporting a widely regarded as corrupt president who was threatening to not leave office, and there was a Democratic successor widely supported by more indigenous and poorer groups. And there's been some semblance of a suggestion that these sanctions were part of a broader U.S. sanctions effort in Guatemala that successfully pushed the sort of more corrupt Guatemalan president out. Why that required shutting down the mine, I don't think the mine was known to have a very strong role in supporting the old president. I think, this was a moment where U.S. policy in Guatemala was using sanctions as a leverage for ensuring sort of a democratic transition of power as they saw it. The connection of that to this, I think, at least many of the people in Estor thought was extremely tenuous.
So the people you spoke to in Estor, they were generally aware that there might be this larger political game that was being played and that they were being impacted by that.
It was amazing to me talking to people in Estor, and you're just in this completely different universe, and a place that I had never heard of before. Researching the story, none of my friends, no knock on anyone. It's just most people in the West have never heard of Estor in Guatemala.
Sure.
There's no reason to. And then you're talking to effectively a local peasant, and they're so like, what's going on at the Office of Foreign Assets Control?
Hmm.
And they're like, you're like, how do you know that? Like, how do you know about like Treasury process? And like, it speaks to how important and powerful these tools are and this stuff is.
They have to know. That's the difference, you know? I mean, if
Estor could sanction
Yeah.
American media companies.
Well, the irony is that American voters don't need to know because they never seem to perceive the effects of these measures. But in the communities where the effects are being felt, you know, you try and understand the thing that's changed the fortunes of your town completely, and then you learn about this office called OFAC. I think it's really striking that you would encounter that there, where you have someone that ends up with a very sophisticated understanding of how they've ended up in this position and how decisions are being made in Washington.
Yeah, no, it was breathtaking, really, in that way. I guess to your point about whether they, you know, what their thoughts on the broader politics, it was sort of like I was kind of taking that counter argument to them and saying, you know, you're upset about the mine closing, but do you think it was helpful for this democratic change of power that some of the supporters of the sanction argued? And they were, you know, kind of saying like, what? This has nothing to do with what is this mine in the northeast of Guatemala really have to do with that?
Yeah. So while people were kind of grappling with their change in circumstances, I mean, one of the things you've just described for us is this idea that this took a long time. The designation came in. There was ambiguity about whether the mines would reopen. And although there was maybe some small severance pay at the beginning, basically the workforce was furloughed and people were not earning an income. And as this dragged out, people started to have to make very difficult decisions. And we talked about this decision that many people made, which was to try and migrate north to get into the United States, where they could maybe find, we talked about this idea of a pathway for economic opportunity. The pathway that was available to them locally shut, so they had to go further afield. And we mentioned earlier in our conversation, Jose Trabaninos, and you write, I think, in a very heartbreaking way about the fact that he decides in this period to emigrate from Guatemala to try and get to the United States. He makes 2 attempts. On the second attempt, he seems to die of heat stroke in Arizona. Do you have any sense from speaking to his family about, you know, what was it that pushed him to make that fateful decision to leave, surely knowing that he was taking an enormous risk in doing so?
Talking to his widow was honestly one of the most difficult sort of experiences I've had in journalism. She was like shell-shocked. Like, we sat on a pier together. She really didn't want to do the interview at first, and I said, no problem, but I'm here if you want to come. And she came with a friend, and I think I may have said a dozen words to her over the course of an hour or so. And she just, you know, she's a widow, a single mother, and what had been a middle-class life just disintegrated in front of her in a unbelievably traumatic way. And, you know, she opened up over time. I think she is distrustful of people who, you know, might want to take advantage of his legacy and his sort of memory, which I understand. But the more I spoke to her, and the more she came to sort of trust me, the more she was able to describe what had happened. And there is no doubt in her mind that if the mine was open, her husband would be alive today. And I think, just to go back to the point I made earlier, like, the margins on time here are so significant because the U.S. had already been sued and petitioned, and members of the Guatemalan government had gone to the U.S. and said, like, this is a tremendous mistake. And the U.S. did eventually listen, but the fact that it took so long arguably cost this woman her husband, and she lives with the consequences of that Treasury decision every day.
And how long did it take to go from the initial designation to when the mines were finally delisted and could reopen?
It was about 14 months.
And within that, one of the other striking things in the story was that one of the mining companies that was sanctioned was mistakenly sanctioned because the Treasury Department believed that a company called Maya Nickel had a connection to Solway. But in fact, that company disputed that and was able to show that there was no connection to Solway. So that was within the story another thing. It wasn't just that the sanctions were added, but it seems to be you've identified a case where the Treasury Department made a designation apparently on incorrect information.
Under Biden, the U.S. Treasury Department imposed sanctions at a pace of more than 9,000 per year. The staff of the Treasury Department is incredibly small. This is like, I hope that doesn't sound too opinionated for a journalist, because it is the consensus view among every current former Treasury or state staffer I spoke to. Their budget is like a teeny tiny little percentage of the Defense Department budget. It's like 1 or 2 planes for like the main instrument of U.S. foreign policy at this point, which is sanctions. And so this is what I was initially going to write about until just to explain, because it's complicated. There's 2 different mining operations. There's Solway, which has basically gathering and then refining the nickel. And then there's Maya Nickel that simply gathers the raw material and doesn't do the refining. And that process is much lower tech, much simpler. Maya Nickel, the only real connection to Solway is that they both are in the same area, in the same industry, and they have joint maintenance on the one extremely gravelly, bumpy road to basically like the port where you can export this stuff. Why Maya Nickel was included in the Solway sanctions was never explained to me by the Treasury Department, and from everything I can gather in my reporting was simply an administrative error. We almost did the story sort of just about that. Ultimately, though, that mine is a lot smaller, so the human consequences of closing it down with like 300 people or so were not as immense as closing the Solway mine. So we ended up leading with the Solway mine because it was sort of more substantial. But to me, like, this was it could have been its own huge story. Like, this totally unrelated mine ended up on this list, and Treasury seems to not have even contested that when I went to them with this information. They really did not fight that they had made a mistake here. And I think, not to get too far afield from Guatemala, but my understanding, and it's been a little bit since I did this reporting, but my understanding is that the United Nations and the EU have much more thorough, responsive mechanisms in place to evaluate sanctions delisting petitions. In the US, I don't know if it's singular, but I know that it is different than at least some other sanctioning bodies, where effectively the same body responsible for imposing the sanctions is also responsible for evaluating requests to undo the sanctions, which is a very sort of judge, jury, and executioner framework. Like, obviously the people who do the action are not necessarily going to be primed to think that they're the ones who made a mistake. And more importantly, maybe their entire sort of modus operandi is to respond to political requests for more sanctions. So there's no administrative bureaucracy set up or political will to evaluate what's been done and make sure it's working and make sure it's even like factually correct.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of structural problem within the way that sanctions policy is designed and enacted is a running theme of the podcast.
Yeah.
But I mean, I want to kind of take a step back. And before we started recording, we talked a little bit about this question of, what did people make of the story? And you mentioned actually, and I was surprised to hear this, that within the series, this was not the story that was most shared or most talked about. And you suggested that that was because there's a little bit of an ambiguous sort of conclusion. And the reason it's ambiguous is that, as you've described, if the US goal was to use this kind of economic pressure to try and push an election in a certain direction, get the Russians out of the corporate structures of these maybe strategically important mines, then actually the sanctions seem to have worked. They didn't work immediately. It took time, but they somewhat achieved their stated goals.
And there was a transition of power, to the next guy, the next president in Guatemala.
Yeah. And within that, again, but there were other justifications that were given. So, for example, this idea that, well, addressing corruption in Guatemala through such measures would also lead to a reduction in migration. So if you make Guatemala more prosperous and stable, maybe more politically representative, you wouldn't have waves of people moving north. But on the other hand, what we see is this really, if you zoom in on this one community and what actually happened to that community within the time frame that the sanctions were in place, so around 14 months, there's a lot of devastation. And so somehow in your reporting, the ambiguous picture is that you can talk to an official in Washington who can sort of crow about things that worked around this policy, but you're also sitting on a pier, by a lake in Guatemala with a young woman who has lost her husband, and she's convinced it's because of this policy. What do you think that your readers should do about grappling with that ambiguity? And I mean, what does that tell us about how we ought to be evaluating and thinking about sanctions policy and the importance of the kind of reporting that you're doing in furnishing that evaluation?
I appreciate the question. I mean, I think the ambiguity, especially for people who go into sort of our practitioners or young people who want to be in, working in the foreign policy world, I think it's it's very easy to say, the U.S. is a bad actor, malicious actor who goes about the world, exerting its imperial might, and there's obvious truth to that. But the people who are doing this work, this designating these mines, are not, I don't think, self-conceptualizing themselves or their work as an inherently imperialist, punitive project. I'm sure many of them thought, some of the indigenous people here have suffered from this mine. Also Russia, also the election. This is something that we can do from Washington to help some of the very poorest people in the world. I'm sure that's how they conceive of it. And I think the broader significance is, if you're looking for, if you're looking for examples of the U.S., being this sort of imperialist dominating force, you might miss how powerful and attractive it often feels in the moment for U.S. officials to feel like they're being the good guy. You know what I mean? And I think that's super important, because the consequences were devastating, and they were awful, and they were fatal, and they were almost exactly contrary to what the U.S.'s stated purpose was. And I think we could do a real disservice by not understanding that a big motivation for sanctions is often very good or the best of intentions, if we assume that they're always sort of self-conceiving as evil people, for people who are critics of sanctions, I think you can sort of miss the. There are ways in which, obviously, like there are sanctions that are just indefensible, but I think a large number of them are driven by people who really think that they're on the cusp of bringing out a fairer, more humane, and more just world. And if critics of that system don't take seriously the moral code in which those people are operating, I think it can become really easy to miss or hard to argue with them, if that makes sense.
I mean, I guess it comes down to this sort of perennial debate where you have people whose instinct is to say what we need to do is abolish sanctions. And then there's another view, which is more that you can maybe reform the way that sanctions are applied. I mean, one thing that sticks out from your reporting is that you're telling a story of a group of government bureaucrats who have good intentions, who are identifying real problems in the world that need to be addressed. But you are repeatedly showing that they lack the resources or the methods or the assessments or the tools that they need to actually be sure that what they think they're doing is happening, or to be able to balance between, what is an acceptable level of harm for a certain amount of good that they think that they're going to achieve. I mean, looking back on this set of reporting that you did, where would you come down on that debate? I mean, is it that if you give these individuals the right tools and you kind of make sure that they're using the right approaches, that we can mitigate the harms? Or is it more that ultimately this is a structural problem about how, quote unquote, American empire operates, and no matter how much you try and give them parameters, like at the end of the day, it's going to produce a lot of harm in places like Estor?
I feel lucky as a journalist that I have an obligation to duck the normative questions like a total coward. But I do think
you're allowed to duck that question.
No.
On the spot
I guess just to weasel my way out of it. I think that there is a consensus among everyone in this debate that it is shocking how little information policymakers have when making these decisions, how little they know about what they're doing before they do it, of the consequences. And these are not, I, as just one reporter, found very quickly, like if I'd been in charge of this sanctions program, I could have identified and written a report about the likely economic consequences. And the fact that my strong impression is that that was never done and never part of the analysis, I think is kind of breathtaking. On the broader question of sort of U.S. sanctions broadly, and the extent to which they are, can be reformed, or whether reform could sort of provide the opportunity for even more devastating, in many ways, sanctions. Just a bit of quick history. I think after the sanctions on Iraq in the 90s, that, as I'm sure you guys have discussed, were really humanitarian disasters, there was a move among academics and practitioners to something called, quote unquote, smart sanctions. That was part of the motivation for this reporting, was to say, okay, people are now like, okay, we should not target food and medicine that children need. So let's do, let's close the big bad mine instead of like all of Guatemala's humanitarian imports, right? And yet, I guess to sort of try to answer your question, I think there's a real danger in the appeal of smart sanctions that were reformed the economic tool and made it seem like it was more sensible, humanitarian, and targeted at the bad guys, that really failed in many ways to like understand the collateral damage that they caused.
Jeff, we've reached the end of our time, which means I have to ask you the question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
I think, being aware of Cuban history, it's been over 60 years. And I've never been to Cuba, but the photos of a society frozen in time really, really makes clear how much OFAC regulation can fundamentally alter and permanently alter the trajectory of an entire nation of people.
Jeff, it was great to have you in the studio in London. And, thank you again for pushing your editors to spend the big bucks so that you could go out to Guatemala and tell these stories. Because I think the series of reports you did last year really pushed forward our understanding of what sanctions effects really look like on the ground.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for everything you do.
I'm Estor Batmagelic, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.